Our today's topic is factor market. Let's begin with the introduction. The factor market analysis highlights two important market structures that are less prevalent in the analysis of product markets. They are monopsony and bilateral monopoly. In many markets, the demand and supply of labor is affected by the actions of trade unions and the government. Such interventions produce imperfections in labor market. Thus, under conditions of monopsony, a strong trade union can raise the wage rate by bargaining with the employer. Let us discuss monopsony in detail. Under monopsony in labor market, a single employer faces large number of workers who are unorganized. Monopsony also prevails when many big employers form a cartel and decide not to compete in the labor market. In labor market, the monopsonist faces an upward-facing supply curve of labor. Accordingly, the monopsonist can affect the wage rate by changing the level of employment. Now, let us discuss wage determination in monopsony when monopoly exists in product market. When there is monopoly in product market, the marginal revenue product, that is MRP curve, will differ from the value of marginal product, that is VMP curve. Also, the MRP curve will lie below the VMP curve as marginal revenue is less than average revenue in case of monopoly and product market. The supply curve of labor SL or wage curve W slopes upwards and the marginal factor cost MFC of labor will lie above the SL curve. At the equilibrium point in monopoly, the MRP will be equals to MFC of labor. In this figure, a monopolist achieves a equilibrium at point E where wage rate LH or OW is fixed and OL number of labor is employed. Apparently, the wage rate LH is less than marginal revenue product LE as well as value of marginal product LF. The difference EH between marginal revenue product LE and wage rate LH is due to the existence of monopsony in labor market. Mrs. John Robinson termed it as monopsonic exploitation. But the difference FE between the value of marginal product LF and the marginal revenue product LE is due to the existence of monopoly in the product market. A worker gets FE amount less than his value of the marginal product due to monopoly in the product market. Moving ahead with next topic, that is bilateral monopoly. A combination of monopsony and monopoly in the same market generates bilateral monopoly. Under bilateral monopoly, a seller is the monopolist of his product or input, or he may be a single buyer of that product or input. Thus, in bilateral monopoly, both the buyer and seller will have to negotiate an acceptable price. A market that is dominated by a profit-maximizing monopolist tends to charge higher price, while a market dominated by monopsonist would pay lower price. However, the negotiations between the monopolist and the monopsonist would lead in fixing the price at a level between the high price demanded by the monopolist and the low price offered by the monopsonist. Therefore, the level of real price agreed upon will be determined by the negotiating power of each side. Considering this figure, where DD is the demand curve of the buyer, depending upon his marginal utility for the product, since there is a single buyer, his demand curve DD would be confronting the monopolist supplier. Therefore, the demand curve DD of buyer, that is monopsonist, would also be average revenue AR curve of the seller monopolist. MR is the marginal revenue curve of the monopolist supplier that corresponds to the AR curve or DD curve. Similarly, MC is the marginal cost curve for the monopolist supplier. The monopsonist considers the marginal cost curve MC of the monopolist as his supply curve. If the monopsonist has complete control over price, the marginal cost curve MC of the monopolist seller will indicate average supply price at which various corresponding quantities of the product will be offered to him. Hence, marginal cost curve MC of the monopolist seller is the supply curve or average supply price ASP to him. Since The average supply price ASP for the monopsonist rises as he procures more quantity of the product. Marginal supply price MSP, which is also called marginal supply cost MSC, will lie above the ASP curve. A monopolist or seller would aim at equating his marginal cost with the marginal revenue in order to maximize profits. Therefore, he will produce or supply OQ1, where MC is also equals to MR and fixed sale price at OP1. On the other hand, the monopsonist or the buyer will equate the MSP with his own utility in order to maximize his satisfaction, as his demand curve DD indicates his marginal utility or the price he is prepared to pay. He will maximize satisfaction by purchasing OQ2 at price OP2. This figure shows that price OP2 is much lower than OP1. Clearly, the price OP1 that the monopolist wants to fix is higher than the price OP2, which the monopsonist wants to fix. This figure shows that there is considerable difference between the prices and the quantities offered for transaction by the monopolist and the monopsonist. Since both of them know that they have to trade with each other, they will have to reach at some mutually agreeable price through negotiations and bargaining with each other. At the end, the price that would be fixed would be somewhere between OP1 and OP2, which is called negotiating range. However, the final price at which the transactions take place depends upon their bargaining skill and dominating power in the market. Now, let us discuss the next topic, that is labor union. Labor union, also called trade union, is an association of workers formed to protect the interest of member workers at their workplace. Labor unions perform various functions such as protection and improvement of the real incomes of workers, providing job security, protecting workers against unfair dismissal, lobbying for better working conditions, and securing compensation for the injuries sustained by member workers at the workplace. Now, let us discuss role of labor union in wage determination. Labor unions have been recognized to play a significant role in negotiations with employers for enhancement of wages, improvement in working rules, complaint procedures, rules governing hiring, firing and promotion of workers, worker benefits, workplace safety and policies, etc. The efforts of labor unions to influence government policies related to fixing of minimum wage rate always help those workers who work at lower wage rates. However, the negotiating powers of the trade union vis-a-vis the employers in their periodic revision of wage are governed by some important factors such as supply of labor. The shortage of labor tilts the balance of power towards the unions. Next is product market competition. If a firm achieves monopoly position and earns high levels of supernormal profit, the labor unions put pressure for a generous wage settlement. Another is globalization. Globalization of the product market has increased the import and export of products and reduced the bargaining power of labor unions. Next is macroeconomic conditions. During the period of recession, there is fall in product demand which causes a decline in labor employment. A fall in the demand for labor weakens the negotiating power of labor union for wage revision. Moving on to next topic, that is economic rent. Classical, that is Ricardian theory, considered rent as the payment for the use of land, which has fixed and inelastic supply. Land was also considered as a free gift of nature which is non-producible. As the supply of land is given, with every rise in its demand, the price of land use rises. On the other hand, if the price of land use falls to zero, the total availability of land will remain unchanged. Therefore, the classical theory regards any price of use of land as economic rent. The neoclassical economists like Mrs. John Robinson say that a part of a total income from any factor of production can be considered as rent. The neoclassical concept of rent is based on the principle of opportunity cost or transfer earnings of factors of production. It is argued that since each factor of production like labor, land, capital have several uses, each factor can be used to earn maximum income in any use. The opportunity cost of a factor, which is that price which can earn by working in the next best use, such as price is also called transfer earnings. The excess of actual earnings of a factor over its transfer earnings is called rent. Thus, rent is equals to actual earnings minus transfer earnings. The modern view of economic rent is based on two facts, namely, supply of land for a particular use is not perfectly inelastic because there are many users and industries that make use of land. Therefore, for any use, a part of the payment made for getting the land would be necessary for retaining it in its present use. All the factors including land often earn some surplus over and above what is necessary to keep the factor in its present use, that is transfer earnings. This surplus earning is called economic rent. Now, let us discuss what are the determinants of rent. Modern theory considers three different conditions in which economic rent is determined. They are: first is rent when supply of factor is perfectly inelastic. The supply of a factor is perfectly inelastic when an increase or decrease in its demand is not followed by any change in its supply. Therefore, its transfer earnings or opportunity cost will be 0. Then, the difference between actual earnings and transfer earnings will be equals to actual earning only. Therefore, in this situation, actual earnings will be treated as economic rent, and this illustrates the situation in which the supply of the factor, that is land, is perfectly inelastic. Let OS be the total land available. The society confronts a perfectly inelastic supply curve SS of land, which shows that even if the price of land falls to 0, its supply will remain unchanged at OS. Thus, the transfer earnings of land will be 0. Curve DD represents total demand for land by the entire society. An intersection of the demand and supply curves determine the rent at OR. Since transfer earnings are 0, price OR will be the economic rent of each unit of land, and the total earnings of OS quantity of land, that is ORES, will be treated as total economic rent. Next is rent when factor supply is perfectly elastic. The supply of a factor is perfectly elastic when its availability is abundant, and a change in its demand will lead to proportionate change in the supply at the existing price. Hence, actual earnings and transfer earnings will be the same. As the difference between actual earnings and transfer earnings will be 0, the economic rent will also be 0. This figure shows that in a situation of perfectly elastic supply of factor, which is land, its every unit will have same transfer earnings, and therefore its supply curve will be perfectly elastic, that is horizontal straight line as shown by SS curve. The transfer earnings of each unit of land employed are OS. If factor demand increases or decreases, actual earning, that is rent, will remain constant. Since for all the units of land the transfer earnings and actual earnings will be equal, there will be 0 surpluses. Hence, economic rent will also be 0. Third is rent when factor supply is less than perfectly elastic. The supply of a factor, which is lent here, is less than perfectly elastic when an increase in its demand is followed by a relatively less increase in supply. In this situation, when demand rises, its supply does not rise in the same proportion. Therefore, its actual earnings would be more than the transfer earnings, and these surplus earnings are called economic rent. In this figure, a unit of land at point A has a supply price which is equals to AQ. Thus, AQ represents its transfer earnings. Similarly, a unit B of land must be paid BR if it is to be retained in the present use. Therefore, BR is the transfer earnings of unit B. Similarly, the transfer earnings of other units C, D, E, F and G are CT, DU, EV, FW and GN respectively. The demand curve DD and supply curve SS intersect at point N, and their intersection determines the equilibrium price or rent as OP. Suppose all the units of land are equally productive, then each unit will earn price OP. But when different units of land are differentiated on the basis of different uses, they will fetch different supply prices. A unit of land which provide higher earnings in other uses will get higher price, that is rent, and vice versa. Thus, the supply curve will be upward sloping. This figure shows that the marginal unit G of land is employed as price OP, thus the transfer earnings unit G is GN. According to classical theory, all the units of land are identical and equally productive, hence every unit must get price OP. Therefore, the intra-marginal units A, B, C, D, E and F will also receive price OP, but price OP is the transfer earnings GN of the marginal unit G, that is higher than the transfer earnings of other intramarginal units. Thus, the actual earnings of the intramarginal units are more than their transfer earnings, hence all the intramarginal units of land receive economic rent. This figure shows that economic rent earned by intramarginal unit A, B, C, D, E and F will be equals to HQ, IR, JT, KU, LV and MW. As stated earlier, the economic rent of marginal unit G will be 0. Total actual earnings of all the units of land OG and OP NG, which are equal to the price OP multiplied by OG number of units, and their total transfer earnings is OSNG as shown by the area under the supply curve up to unit G. Since economic rent is calculated by deducting transfer earnings from actual earnings, total economic rent earned by all the OG units of land will be SNP. It is important to note that the difference between the classical and the modern thoughts on rent arise due to the fact that Ricardo viewed rent from the perspective of economy or society as a whole, it means macro level, while the modern economists view it from micro level, that is demand by a firm or an individual producer only. Last topic of the session is quasi-rent. Marshall introduced the concept quasi-rent, which is an extension of Ricardian concept of rent. According to Marshall, the supply of capital equipment, that is machinery, is perfectly inelastic in the short run and the cost of its production becomes irrelevant once it is produced. Thus, the short run earnings of capital equipment also depends upon demand conditions which are similar to land. Since capital equipments are not permanently in fixed supply like land, their supply is elastic in the long run. Marshall called the short run earnings of capital as quasi-rent. Thus, quasi-rent is only a temporary surplus earned by the owner of the capital equipment in the short run due to unexpected increase in its demand. Since some maintenance costs are incurred even in the short run to keep the machinery in working order, therefore, quasi-rent may be defined as the short run earnings of a machine minus its maintenance cost. Thus, quasi-rent is the excess of total revenue earned by capital, that is machinery, over and above its total variable cost in the short run. Since capital equipments are produced, their supply is elastic in the long run. Therefore, quasi-rent will disappear in the long run. This figure illustrates the earnings of quasi-rent. In this figure, output is measured on x-axis and the price and cost of output is measured on y-axis. ATC represents average total cost and AVC represents average variable cost in the short run. The AVC includes all the variable cost of production like labor, raw material, etc., as well as the maintenance cost of the unit of machinery during the short run. Now, suppose the demand for machinery determines its price OP. At price OP, the price line is PL, which also represents marginal revenue MR as well as average revenue AR. With price line PL, the entrepreneur is in equilibrium at point Q, where MC curve is equals to price OP. Thus, the firm produces OM level of output and earns OMQP as total revenue, while its total variable cost incurred is OMEF. The area FEQP represents the surplus of total revenue over total variable cost, which is called quasi-rent. If the demand for machines declines and the price falls to OP double dash, then the price line confronting the firm will be P double dash L double dash. Price line P double dash L double dash also represents marginal revenue MR as well as average revenue AR. Hence, equilibrium position will be attained at point S, where the firm will produce OM double dash quantity of machines. Note that point S is also the minimum level on the average variable cost AVC curve. Therefore, at point S, the total revenue earned OM double dash as P double dash. is just equal to cover the total variable cost, which is also OM double dash SP double dash. Therefore, the quasi rent earned by capital will be 0. The entrepreneur will stop production if the price falls below OP double dash, due to which total revenue earned will be less than the total variable cost. Thus, quasi rent cannot be negative. Let's summarize at the end. The analysis of factor market highlights monopsony and bilateral monopoly market structures prevalent in labor markets. Monopsony situation arises when a single employer or a collusion of many employers confront a large number of workers who are unorganized and geographically immobile. In monopsony market, a worker is subject to exploitation because he gets less than his marginal revenue product. To escape exploitation, workers join labor unions. The neoclassical economists argue that each factor of production can be employed for several uses, and in every use it can earn maximum income. The opportunity cost of a factor is that price which it can earn by working in the next best alternative. The amount by which the actual earnings of a factor exceed its transfer earnings is called rent. Marshall introduced the concept of quasi-rent, which refers to short-run earnings of capital only. Thank you.